astronomer Robert Jastrow said, and this guy's an agnostic. He was not a believer in God. He was not a believer in Jesus. He said, and I quote, he said, astronomers now find that they've painted themselves into a corner because they've proven by their own methods that the universe began abruptly in an act of creation to which it can trace the seeds of every star, every planet, every living thing in this cosmos and on the earth. And they have found that this is a product of forces that they cannot hope to discover. So he's saying, look, there is something beyond our universe. And he said that there are what I or anyone would call supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact.
So we're just going to ignore the fact that that quote was actually from an interview with Robert Jastrow that was literally titled "A Scientist Caught Between Two Faiths from Christianity Today." We'll also ignore the fact that it's from as far back as 1982, and our understanding has broadened since then. But I want to use this quote to demonstrate something that I was trying to show in my Evolutionists Say the Darndest Things episode, that quote mining is only ever used as a weapon, and it's not exactly a legitimate one at that. But I don't have to necessarily just do that, since that's not the focus of this video. I'm just using that as an example. No, the focus of today's video will be asking, why are we legitimizing Matt Powell? Alright everybody, as per usual, before we start playing the rest of the video that I'm going to be using to make my point, let's go ahead and get some fan art out of the way. We have one from Disco Stone to begin with, and this is probably the tamest Rule 63 Suris that I've ever seen. Next we have Jimmy, or Mr. Atheist, apparently painting me like one of his French girls. And then finally we have an incredibly socially awkward Suris from Mikey Kitty. As always, thank you guys for the fan art, and let's go ahead and get right into the next point of Powell.
And that's from an agnostic astronomer. So we have to look at what these scientists are saying, even what some of these agnostics are saying. They're admitting that it takes intelligence to create life.
Alright, so for context, there was a debate on Modern Day Debate where Raging Atheist, or Nakasuchi, went against Matt Powell, and there's a lot more context for this particular conversation that you can find over on Raging Atheist's channel. My focus right now will not be the debate or its history, my focus right now will just be the things coming out of Matt Powell's mouth, and these are things that he's echoed hundreds of times. This point comes directly after the point that I showed in the beginning of my video, where, at best, what Robert Jastrow had actually said was that there seems to be evidence of the supernatural in our universe. I'm willing to ignore the standard refutation of that, since we know that supernatural things and science don't exactly mix, and instead want to point the audience to what Matt Powell has actually done directly after that statement in saying that this points to intelligence. Seeing as we have zero evidence of anything supernatural, we have nothing to compare it to, and thus we have no way of determining that the idea of the supernatural and the idea of intelligence must necessarily correlate to one another. Again, the actual quote that you're using is from an interview and not from any type of peer-reviewed source, so what Robert Jastrow says out of his own ass has no bearing on the scientific community, especially not things that he said 40 years ago. I want to use this to talk about my larger point, which is why are we legitimizing Matt Powell when the only thing that he seems to be able to do is the same old creationist tactics with zero deviation. There was a point that Matt Dillahunty made about the debate between Bill Nye and Ken Ham. He had mentioned once that it was one of the most famous debates in this community of all time. He also wondered, though, if there may have been a noticeably measurable negative effect of the end of that debate, in where Ken Ham managed to get popularity and legitimization by debating someone as famous as Bill Nye. And that kind of got me thinking, one of the big issues with public debates is that you end up sharing an arena with this person as opposed to dragging them into your own the same way you do with a response video. I don't necessarily hold the position that dragging somebody into any arena suddenly means that their position is now more valid, but I do think that it does lend at least a little bit of legitimacy to their position, especially in the eyes of those who were already sycophantic enough to root for them as if they're some kind of football team.
And one of the most famous teachers of evolution, the co-founder of evolution, Ernst Haeckel himself, who was convicted of fraud by his own university, by the way, he said, and I quote, he said, "Spontaneous generation must be true." Now, whenever somebody says something must be true, you ever see the movies where they're like, "Oh, this must be true"? You know, obviously that's a statement must be true. That phrase is a phrase of desperation.
So, Ernst Haeckel is not the co-founder of evolution. In fact, if you want somebody to be the co-founder of evolution, you may as well be looking at Alfred Russel Wallace. Ernst Haeckel was more famous for his embryology drawings. That all aside, though, we know that spontaneous generation is not true, mainly because we used to think that mold spontaneously generated on things, but now we understand that there are tiny microscopic organisms that start that process. We also understand that maggots don't immediately just emerge from rotting things, they are also brought in from flies. We just didn't see them come in at that time. The entire idea of spontaneous generation was pretty much thrown out the window. However, there's a reason that I'm harping on this point, and it's because Matt Powell makes a follow-up point in response to this.
So Ernst Haeckel was desperate, and he's saying spontaneous generation must be true, not because it had been proven in the laboratory, but because otherwise it would be necessary to believe in a creator. That's what he said. And so he's saying if spontaneous generation did not happen, then I would have to believe in God. Ernst Haeckel didn't want to believe in God. He wanted to believe what he wanted to believe. And so therefore he believed in spontaneous generation, or something that's known as abiogenesis.
Okay, so for everybody listening, spontaneous generation is the supposed production of living organisms from non-living matter, as inferred from the apparent appearance of some life in supposedly sterile environments. Abiogenesis, on the other hand, is the original evolution of life of living organisms from inorganic or inanimate substances. Spontaneous generation refers to something that we saw every day and we didn't understand how it worked, like the formation of mold and maggots. Abiogenesis, on the other hand, refers specifically to a set of conditions that would have been present on Earth about 4 billion years ago. These are in no way, shape, and form the same thing, but by conflating the two when one is demonstrably false, Matt gets to assert that his position must be the correct one. It's a little bit like affirming the consequent. When you affirm the consequent, you affirm one of your premises must be true and throw it into your conclusion. So if premise 1 is, if there's no gas in the car won't run, and if premise 2 is that the car won't run, then the conclusion is, therefore, there's no gas in the car. This is ignoring the myriad of possibilities that could possibly lead to the car not running that have nothing to do with its gas. So for instance, for Matt Powell's version of affirming the consequent, it would be, if we don't understand the origin of life, then it must be God. Premise 2, we don't understand the origin of life. Therefore, premise 3, the origin of life must be God. This is, as with the car scenario, ignoring the myriad of possibilities that could have led to the origin of life. God is not the only one. But it's not just the logical fallacies that I want to harp on, because Matt is full of them. I would also like to focus on some of the other disingenuous methods that he utilizes during his conversations. So let's skip forward ahead and find one of those.
And at one point there was no time, no space, no matter. There was just this little infinitesimal amount of space.
I am hoping that everyone in the audience caught that. If you didn't, I will play it one more time.
And at one point there was no time, no space, no matter. There was just this little infinitesimal amount of space.
If you don't understand the issue yet, I'm going to go ahead and go to the next part of his point, and then show why this is problematic.
If that space exploded and created time, created space and matter...
Alright, so I'm hoping that everybody watching now has been able to figure out what the issue is. First of all, if there is no space, then space cannot explode to create space. That makes no sense. Secondly, what he's referring to is the singularity, and the singularity would have been an incredibly compact state of matter, not space. It would be occupying an infinitely small amount of space, but seeing as there would be no change in this matter, there would be no time, since time is a measurement of change. That all said though, you do see the issue here, I hope, in that his point relies on one of the laws of thermodynamics in order to function. However, he demonstrates he has no understanding of what this law is. There are some super chats later where people ask him to show the math for that, and he says that nobody could do that, even though we have the math for that. Therefore, it has been done by a person and or computer, so his point's irrelevant. However, I think there's a simpler way to go about that. Instead of asking him to show the math for it, which usually somebody would not be able to do, just asking him if he understood that his entire sentence was a giant load of contradictions. You can't say that there's no space and then space exploded. If you want to say that the first law of thermodynamics holds true and therefore your God exists, you can't then showcase the law of thermodynamics as if it's a giant set of whopping contradictions. I use this with my other points to try to show you guys that this is somebody who we should not be legitimizing. I don't see why this person is allowed to even be on debate platforms when he demonstrates he has literally zero knowledge of any of these concepts. But simply having no knowledge of these concepts doesn't mean that you shouldn't be in an open debate space. If anything, having no knowledge of these concepts concepts and trying to actually debate them would be an avenue for learning. But as everyone knows, if you've seen my channel long enough, we all know that Matt Powell's also a reprehensible human being. So it's not just the question of should we be legitimizing somebody who espouses ideas to which they can't back up. No, I would like to couple that with the point that we shouldn't be legitimizing someone who also espouses ideas like these. Take a look.
Tyler Durden says, debate question for Matt. Do you value the U.S. Constitution? And if so, how do you justify your position that the government should execute homosexuals? And if you don't believe it, then why not?
Yeah. So first and foremost, the only way that somebody could become a homo, the Bible says, is the person has to first hate God. They have to just hate God. And the Bible says that the Spirit of God is wooing every man. And when somebody gets to that point where they're rejecting God, God finally takes that limiter off of them and turns them over to a reprobate mind. And so that's the reason why I believe that homosexuals are dangerous and that many of them are child molesters, because on a common sense level, a man that would have sex with another man would have sex with anything. And so, of course, I believe the U.S. Constitution applies. In fact, in the 1800s, it was perfectly legal if your wife was sleeping with another man to go in and just take the life of both of them. I don't advocate for that. I think that's wicked and sinful. I believe it's the government's job to execute criminals. But with regards to the homosexual community, you better believe that I have a severe problem with them. And we will never back down to the LGBTQ or whatever you want to call them. That's what I believe. And I believe that it's totally constitutional.
And there you have it, folks, the dancing around justification for the government execution of homosexuals, based solely on the fact that he thinks that it's constitutional, and he thinks that it's icky, and he thinks that they are reprobate-minded, barring the fact that none of that is actually in the United States Constitution. In fact, in regards to homosexuality, the only thing close you can find in the United States Constitution is that the Constitution itself has no limits on who can and cannot get married, and that is the closest thing I can find in regards to Matt's claim that it's constitutional to execute them. But he didn't just say people who are homosexual. No, he said anybody in the LGBTQ community. This would mean that if you're lesbian, homosexual, bisexual, pansexual, queer of any kind, or any other portion of the acronym, since he said that it could be whatever it needs to be, he thinks that they're okay to be executed and that that's constitutional as well. His justification for this, however, is, well, I'm gonna play the clip again because it speaks better than I could.
Martha Camijo asked Matt what he would do if he had a gay kid. Did you ask that already? Sorry.
No, I didn't. I didn't even see that one. I'm sorry, Martha.
No problem. Thanks for your super chat, Martha, and thanks for the other ones before. Sorry, I was like trying to scatterbrain, but Matt, they had asked Matt what he would do if he had a gay kid.
Well, that's like asking me, what if your kid turned out to be Adolf Hitler? What if your kid turned out to be Mussolini?
That's not the same thing,
and
dude.
that's
the same thing.
That's not the same thing.
Yeah, I do believe that.
So gay people have killed millions and millions.
No, I'm not saying that they have. I'm just saying that question is like asking me, well, what if your kid turned out to be an axe murderer?
Except the only possible way that question could be framed that way is if these were comparable things. So in the twisted mind of Matt Powell, who for some reason we are legitimizing with allowing him on public platforms, but in the twisted mind of Matt Powell, it's okay to say that homosexual people and anybody in the LGBTQ are the same as Hitler. So what you're saying is, essentially, both of my girlfriends, who are both pansexual and therefore part of the LGBTQ, are both morally equivalent to either Hitler or an axe murderer and deserve to die. So not only do we have an individual who can't make a logical argument to save his life, the only thing he's able to do is quote mine, apparently this person is legitimately thought-provoking enough that we see fit to have public discourse with him. I'm not talking about response videos, I'm not talking about any of that stuff, because that's stuff that you can do on your own time in your own arena. I'm talking about sharing a podium with this person. I find it very weird that we've somehow gotten to the point where ideas like Matt's seem like they deserve scrutiny as opposed to ridicule. There may have been a point where his ideas merited scrutiny, and there may still be some legitimate good that can come from scrutinizing his opinions and showing where they are logically invalid. There are certainly enough members in the NIFB, for instance, who definitely wouldn't come out if they were simply poked, prodded, and made fun of. But at the same time, I do have to wonder, are we not somehow, in some way, legitimizing this person and his horrible ideas by sharing the podium with him. And note, I'm not talking about deplatforming or anything like that. Considering that Matt has his own channel and platform, he can go do his own thing and he's got his own audience. But I still can't help but wrestle with the idea that somebody like Matt, who thinks that people in the LGBTQ are equivalent of Hitler, whose argument relies on things he can't even properly articulate, and whose best defense is quote mining people the same way that he cherry picks his own Bible, I just can't help but think that people like him and Ken Ham and Hovind, if not handled effectively during public discourse, just end up looking more legitimate at the end. Obviously, there's a whole lot that can be earned and learned by ripping someone apart in a public forum. This is actually what happened during the Bill Nye and Ken Ham debate. This brings up a question I brought up earlier in the video, where Matt Dillahunty asked if maybe there was some measurable harm in someone as prolific as Bill Nye sharing the podium with someone as abhorrent as Ken Ham. So I guess the best thing I can do is leave the question up to you guys. What do you guys think? Because me, personally, I'm torn. I'm trying my best to stay unbiased while I'm doing this video, because if you can ask people who were in contact with me during the course of that debate, I had some more physical and visceral reactions. Probably because, well, I share a house with somebody who used to be stuck in a family that was NIFB, and I happen to be dating two people who are in the group that Matt is so vehemently saying deserve death. Maybe I'm not the right person to talk about this situation because too much of it hits too close to home. Maybe that's the reason why I wrestle with this so much. I don't know the real answer. So let's get the discussion going in the comment section. Do you think platforming these people lends some legitimacy to them? Do you think it all depends on how they're handled during the course of the conversation? Do you think it depends on who the speaker is against them? There's a lot of nuance to this particular issue, and I would hope that nobody in the course of the comments tries to paint this as a black and white problem. It's not. But with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one. I look forward to watching your discussions in the comment section and on my Discord. Insert end of video tagline here.